Chord melody playing can feel elusive. So many great arrangements use loads of complex chords. Take my own arrangement of In a Sentimental Mood, for example. But it doesn't have to be that complicated. You can harmonise a melody using smaller, simpler chords, and today I'll show you how. We're using my standard of the month here on YouTube and Patreon, Cole Porter's You'd Be So Nice to Come Home To. First, we need to know the melody. Let's take the opening 8 bars of You'd Be So Nice. Before I play the melody, we need to ground ourselves within the key, which is the key of A minor. Now, if you took the A natural minor scale, which is just a C major scale, but starting from A, we'd have the following notes: A, B, C, D, E, F, G, A. And there's a likelihood that our melody is going to be drawn largely from those notes. The opening 8 bars goes like this. With those last 2 notes really being a pickup into the next phrase. The way I played the melody there, dead square, like almost by the real book, and that's not how I'm going to want to play it in my arrangement. And when you do your own chord melody arrangements, that's one thing. You might have, you might have the melody down in a very vanilla fashion, if you like, and you want to take some of the square edges off, if you like, move some notes a beat or half a beat early to make things a little bit more rhythmic and interesting and to have a sense of forward momentum. And it sounds incredibly obvious, but learning a chord melody or working on a chord melody, creating your own, of course, a good knowledge of the melody first is a prerequisite. I've done it myself before. I've tried to learn some crazy chord melody arrangement and I don't really know the melody that well, so it's really hard. Whereas if you know the melody well, you can see it through standing out through all the other notes that you might have to play in chords and inversions. Now, you could harmonise every single note, but that can get fiddly and sometimes sound overly dense. Instead, I like to focus on the standout notes, the ones that really land and define the melody. Because some notes are more important than others, some just act as passing notes, whereas others as if it's a language, almost like the subject or the verb in a sentence. So we need to think about which notes make sense to harmonise, which notes are passing notes, which notes are standout notes. You could harmonise the first bit, but I see it as basically that's the important note in the first phrase, and then that one's pretty standout too, and then I feel that's happening very quick, that bit, so I might ignore that, and it's kind of passing for the phrase to resolve into. So those, to me, those last 2 notes would make sense to do. Could harmonise that, but to me that's a lead up to this note, so I'd probably harmonise that. That's the standout note of that bit. Then that one, and then the next 2 notes for me are passing to get to that one, so I'll probably harmonise that one. That's a lead up to somewhere else, so I probably wouldn't bother with those 2. So it's quite often notes which end a phrase or high up within a phrase, or you feel like some notes are leading to, and obviously where notes happen quickly with faster rhythms, you can just ignore those and play those in single notes. But it's very easy to think chord melody, you've got to harmonise everything. No, you don't. And in fact, sometimes it would sound better for not doing so. Once we've picked those standout melody notes, we need to understand the interval we're trying to harmonise. So let's go through the melody notes and talk through the intervals involved. Now, when analysing the melody, to help us be able to pick chords to harmonise the melody with, we need to be able to look at a note and look at the chord at that moment in time and go, right, that's a root for that chord, that's a third for that chord, and so on. Just looking at the melody on the screen, the first chord is A minor, and we start with an A. We go root, second, up to the third. And just noticing there, the 2 of those notes are chord tones, root and third. The second is just a passing note. We then land on a B, which is the root of the B minor 7 flat 5. Then we've got this A and a G. That's the 4th and then the 3rd of the E7. Now, just so far, we're mainly using chord tones with passing notes in between. We've got the sharp there in the notation because you don't get a G sharp in the key of A minor, although it's the most common accidental you're going to get in that key. Then on the A minor, we go to close off the phrase. We're going root to 5th on the A minor, and just this is something you want to try and do in your improv as well. Try and resolve to chord tones with your phrases. Not every single time, but it gives an idea, strength, and it sounds resolved and finished then. We can see in the notation there's a sharp next. There's a D sharp to an E. So against this A minor, this is like a flat 5 up to the 5th. So it's like a chromatic approach note there. So that's a note outside of the chord. And then we land on one of my favourite intervals against a G minor. We have a ninth on the top for a second, I think of it as a ninth. Very sweet sounding interval. Going down to the 5th of a C. And then we play the 3rd and 2nd, which is sending us down to a C, which is the 5th of our F chord. And then we finish with a 6, 7 on the F chord, which is leading up, as I say, into the next phrase on a B minor 7 flat 5. Now, I'd imagine for some people looking at that, me talking through that, it's easy enough to follow. But I can think back to a time for myself when it wouldn't have been. And it might be you're thinking, how on earth do I learn all that stuff? And what it comes down to is knowing the notes in your chords. So A minor 7, what notes are in it? There's a root 3rd, 5th and 7th, hopefully. And then next step, that's A, C, E and a G. And then it's being able to look at the melody and the chord above and go, oh, right, we start with A, B, C, which is 1, 2, 3, flat 3 that is, of the A minor. So it is about just getting that information into here about what notes are in which chords. And you might not have that information readily available yet, but I can tell you now, if you want to play chord melodies well and create your own, then it's invaluable stuff to know. We've got our melody, we understand the intervals, now we need to put notes underneath that to form the harmony. Now we could put one note underneath that like I did in my recent video with Moon River, or like we're going to do today, we're going to put 2 notes that forms a 3-note chord, so a triad. Here are a few options. You could use a triad that has that interval we want on top. Now, triads are great for harmonizing melodies because they're strong, they're simple, relatively easy to find on the guitar. But just to run through some of the shapes that I would utilize when trying to do this, the kind of knowledge you need, just good triads across the guitar. And if you think about chord melody, you want to put the melody ideally either on the B or the E string so that it cuts through. So what you need to know is, say if you take the chord A minor, here's A minor as a triad, root 3rd, 5th. So if the 5th was on the top, that's a good choice. Then you need to be able to take that down, up the fretboard. There it is with the root on the top, 3rd, 5th, root. Here it is with the flat 3 on the top. We're going to use that one because the melody's got an A minor with the flat 3 on the top. Back to the first one, but an octave higher, root 3rd, 5th. So those 3 triads of A minor give me the 5th on the top, the root on the top, the flat 3 on the top, back to the 5th on the top. I could keep going, but maybe a bit high to use viably in a song. And then you can find exactly the same sound in the sense of 1, 3, 5 and then the different intervals, inversions, on the next 3 strings, so on D, G, B. So just take A minor and I'm finding exactly the same thing with the 5th on the top, with the root on the top, with the flat 3 on the top. We're going to use some of those as well because we've got A minor chords with the 5th or the root on the top that we need for that melody. Now, if we're using 3-note voicings, we do run into one small issue, is that, most chords in jazz are 7ths, or most chord charts are written with, A minor 7, D7, G major 7, for instance. Those chords obviously have 4 notes, so root, 3rd, 5th, and 7th. So if we're just going to use 3, what can we do? So sometimes you might have a 4 or maybe 5-note chord and you want to try and do a 3-note voicing for it, and you can just take those triads and add a note on top. Say for instance, if I take this A minor, if I add the 2nd on top or 9th on top, a B on the top, that would be useful, and I actually do use that for a G minor in the arrangement. If you took A minor 7, if you got A minor like this is a 5th on the top, so I could add a 7th on the top. So now it's root 3, 7. Take that string in, just check what I've written for you guys. Yep, I've written the same thing, look. There's A minor, now I put the 7th on the top. Or an A minor with the 4th on the top, rather than the 3rd, so you go from that. So sometimes you can take those triads and you can just raise one of the notes, raise the note on top to give you another interval that you might need for a melody. So strong knowledge of triads, and then you can manipulate that good knowledge of triads by adding changing the highest note to an interval that you might need at that moment in time. Now that you've seen the shapes, I'll play you through the first 8 bars of my chord melody and talk through it. Let me break that down for you. So I ignored the first 2 notes, the root and second of the A minor, and then I used an A minor triad with the 3rd on the top to harmonise the first standout note, if you like. Then I'm just treating these as passing notes. And then we've got an A minor with the root on the top, triad, to an A minor with the 5th on the top. I changed the rhythm slightly on the E7 as well, just to make it flow a bit better. I didn't like how it was written in the sort of typical real book kind of way to begin with. And then I'm going to ignore these 2 notes because to me they are leading somewhere. The next chord is a G minor with the 9th. So I'm going to get the triad, G minor, and put the 9th on top, above the root. And then I've done something a bit sneaky here. The chord is C7. I've moved it slightly earlier, if you look. I've put it on the end of 4 just to make it a bit more interesting. And we've got we've got flat 7, 9, and 5th. And so it is a 3-note voicing of actually a 5-note chord of C9. If you imagine that guitar shape, I've just taken the top of that off because that works well going like that. And then passing notes with a slide to make it sound nice to an F major with the 5th on the top, triad. Now those markings with the arrow going up is to mean that you don't want to just use your plectrum just to go through the fingers in one go. So you want to hear them staggered like that, very quickly, but still just makes it a bit more expressive. And then these are just passing leading notes, I should say, to the next standout note, if you like. So there I've just used triads, apart from on the G minor I took a triad then had to add a 9th on the top. On the C7 I've used C9, a reduced voicing of that, a 3-note voicing of it. And we've spoken a lot about just, how do you take a melody, you then analyse the notes, work out the intervals, and you find chords. And today we're looking at using triads and 3-note voicings of 4-note chords maybe, or even 5-note chords like on the C9 I was using. The other thing is how you play it. And I'm going to play you my full arrangement now, but just remember that I've not just put together kind of the notes and the chords where I want to harmonise them. I've also thought about, I'm going to sustain that chord, or I'm going to gradually strum through that chord. I'm going to cut that chord off and have a staccato feel. So I've got contrast, but also that I play the arrangement with feeling, or that's the intention. Hopefully it comes across. Could it be more harmonically rich? Sure, but that's not the point. The point is, can we make a melody sound beautiful with simple 3-note voicings? Because I often find in jazz guitar it's very easy to overlook the simple solutions. Now, I always forget to say what I'm playing through in these videos, and people always comment. So what I'm using there is actually a new toy, the Tone King Imperial preamp, which seemed to have broken the internet a few months ago and been very difficult to get hold of. Got it today, so just getting used to that. And then the reverbs from the Universal Audio Golden reverberator. And I'm going into the Quilter Tone Block 202 using the FR setting. If you want the full arrangement, the PDF with tab and notation from today's lesson, including the full chorus, is available on the supporter tier of my Patreon page. That tier also gives you access to all of my chord melodies. Now, if you don't know this tune yet, it's a fantastic one to add to your repertoire. I've put my lesson on the chords and the harmony up on the screen, along with my popular video on the chord melody arranging from last month. Thanks so much for watching. Leave any questions you have below, and don't forget, jazz guitar lessons here every Monday with myself, Andy. Until next time, you take care.